He was the king of New York real estate. She was the ex-wife he'd erased. A temporary scaffolding he'd torn down. At his own lavish gala, Richard Thorne laughed, a champagne flute in hand, and told the entire city she'd be forgotten. He was wrong. Because while he was busy building his empire of glass and steel, he never saw the man watching from the shadows. A billionaire who was about to change the skyline itself. And that man had just one person in mind to help him, the one woman Richard swore the world would never, ever remember. The air at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Denver was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was the annual Thorne Foundation Gala, the absolute pinnacle of New York City's philanthropic calendar. And tonight it was also a coronation. Leora Harris stood in the shadows of a towering Egyptian column, her simple midnight blue gown a stark contrast to the glittering sequins and diamonds that surrounded her. This was her last official duty as Mrs. Thorne. The divorce papers were signed, the settlement a paltry, insulting fraction of the empire she had helped build. Richard Thorne, her ex-husband, was at the center of the room, of course. He was a lion of a man with a predator's smile and a mane of perfectly silvered hair. He was born into wealth but had a street fighter's instinct for acquisition, and he'd acquired a new fiancée, Isabella Vance. Isabella was a decade younger than Leora, a new model, as the Page Six columnists had gleefully called her. She was the daughter of a rival real estate family, making their union less a marriage and more a merger. Leora just had to get through the night. She'd promised her name on the gala's organizing committee, a commitment she'd made a year ago in a different life. Now she just wanted to disappear. And I have to thank my incredible partner. Richard's voice boomed from the stage, silencing the crowd. He raised his glass to Isabella, who glowed beside him. Isabella has shown me what a true partnership looks like. Building a legacy isn't just about blueprints. It's about vision. It's about a future. Leora felt the familiar cold twist in her stomach. That was her word. Vision. You see, Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescending charm, in this business, you learn a lot about structure. Some people are architects destined to design the future, and others. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the room, and for one sickening moment his eyes seemed to find Leora's in the darkness. Others are just temporary scaffolding, useful for a time perhaps, but ultimately designed to be torn down and forgotten. To the future. To the future, the crowd roared back. The glass in Leora's hand trembled. Scaffolding. He hadn't just divorced her. He had demolished her. The words were a public execution. He was telling his world, their world, that she was nothing. A temporary footnote to his great man story. She turned her movement stiff and walked away from the light. She slipped out the massive glass doors into the humid New York night, the applause for Richard and Isabella ringing in her ears. The life she had known, the Park Avenue apartment, the studio she'd been allowed to keep as a hobby, the pretense of being a partner, was gone. Richard wasn't just wrong. He was a liar. She wasn't scaffolding. She had been the goddamn foundation. Leora Harris had been a brilliant architect, top of her class at MIT. She specialized in sustainable, community-focused urban design. Then she met Richard Thorne. He'd loved her passion, he said. He'd invested in her first small firm, only to slowly, systematically absorb it into his own monolithic corporation, Thorne Properties. Her designs, which integrated green space and community centers, were quaint, but not profitable. Her work on modular, affordable housing was charity, not business. He'd gaslit her for 15 years, transforming her from a visionary architect into a high-society hostess, a manager of guest lists and dinner menus. Now at 42, she was an ex-wife with a suppressed career and a name her husband had just publicly declared forgotten. She hailed a cab, the rain starting to slick the pavement, and gave the driver an address in Brooklyn. Not to a penthouse, but to a small fifth-floor walk-up she'd rented with the last of her private savings. As the cab crossed the bridge, the glittering Manhattan skyline, a skyline Richard was actively trying to own, mocked her. "He'd be forgotten," she whispered to the foggy window, tasting the salt of a single furious tear. "We'll see about that, Richard. We will see." The next 6 months were a brutal education in gravity. Leora's new life was a cramped studio in Greenpoint, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbors arguing over finances, a sound she'd never once heard on Park Avenue. Her friends from her former life evaporated. The calls stopped. The lunch invitations, which used to fill her calendar, were now replaced by automated rejection emails. "While your portfolio is impressive, Ms. Harris, we are looking for candidates with more recent project experience. We regret to inform you that the position has been filled." Richard's shadow was long. He hadn't just declared her forgotten. He was actively enforcing it. She heard through a former and brave assistant that Richard had put the word out: "Leora is emotional, unstable after the divorce, not ready for high-stakes projects." He was poisoning the well. He wasn't just letting her be forgotten, he was burying her alive. She was taking on freelance drafting work, designing kitchen renovations for dentists in New Jersey, anything to pay the bills. The paltry settlement was dwindling, most of it going to her lawyer. One rainy Tuesday, while digging through a box of old files she'd managed to rescue from her old life, a box she'd labeled "Do Not Touch" in bold red marker. Much to Richard's annoyance, she found it. It was a black, sleek external hard drive. On it was a single white label, Oasis. Her hands trembled. Oasis was her thesis, her masterpiece, the project she'd poured her soul into before Richard had ever entered the picture. It wasn't just a building, it was an ecosystem, a 2-block, self-sustaining micro-city. It combined residential units from luxury to subsidized vertical farms, a water reclamation plant that filtered gray water through cascading public gardens, and a central agora for community engagement. It was designed to be built in the shells of old industrial neighborhoods, breathing life back into urban decay. She plugged the drive into her aging laptop. The files were still there. The renderings, the physics calculations, the social integration matrices. It was beautiful. It was brilliant. And Richard had hated it. She remembered the night she showed it to him back when they were still new. He'd swirled his scotch and smiled that dismissive smile. "Leora, my love, it's adorable. A pipe dream for hippies. People don't want community. They want doormen. They want exclusivity. They want views. They don't want to look at a turnip farm growing on their wall." He told her to file it away, to focus on the real work, designing the opulent, sterile lobbies of his glass and steel coffins. A new, potent anger burned through her despair. He hadn't just dismissed her work, he'd dismissed her soul. As if summoned by her anger, an ad popped up on her screen. "The Sterling Prize for Urban Innovation. $1,000 grand prize. Submit your vision for the city of tomorrow. Sterling, as in Damien Sterling." If Richard Thorne was the king of New York real estate, Damien Sterling was the ghost in the machine. He was a new money god, a tech billionaire who'd made his fortune in predictive AI and logistical algorithms before he was 30. He was a recluse known for funding impossible world-changing projects, atmospheric carbon capture, autonomous shipping fleets, and apparently urban innovation. He was also Richard Thorne's greatest obsession and least favorite topic. Richard saw him as an upstart, a coder, who didn't understand the concrete and blood of building a city. Damien, for his part, seemed to not see Richard at all. The deadline for the Sterling Prize was in 48 hours. Leora looked at her screen at the Oasis files. She looked around her tiny studio at the stack of unpaid bills. She thought about Richard's words: temporary scaffolding, forgotten. "Not today," she said to the empty room. For the next 47 hours she didn't sleep. She tore her old project apart. The core idea was sound, but the tech was 15 years old. She updated the materials, integrating new self-healing composites. She replaced her old solar models with new transparent photovoltaic glass. She rewrote the code for the AI-driven resource management using principles she'd only read about in Wired. She was no longer just a designer. She was a warrior. She was fueled by rage, cheap coffee, and the desperate primal need to prove to herself that she existed. With 10 minutes to spare, she hit submit. She collapsed onto her small cot, the laptop falling to the floor, and slept for the first time in 2 days, dreaming of cities that breathed. A week later, Leora was in the midst of designing a bathroom renovation for a poodle groomer when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She ignored it. It buzzed again, insistently. She sighed and picked it up. Leora Harris. Ms. Harris, a crisp, British-accented voice said. This is Ariane Powell, Chief of Staff for Damien Sterling. Leora's heart stopped. She nearly dropped the phone. Yes. Mr. Sterling has reviewed your submission for the Innovation Prize, the Oasis. This was it. The rejection. She braced herself. I understand. It was a long shot. Mr. Sterling finds your central thesis intriguing. Ariane continued as if Leora hadn't spoken. He has some technical questions. He would like to meet with you. Meet like? A phone call. In person. At Sterling Tower. This afternoon. This afternoon? I'm in Brooklyn. I'm not dressed. Leora looked down at her paint-splattered jeans and old MIT sweatshirt. 2 p.m. A car is on its way to you now. It will be there in 20 minutes. The line clicked dead. The entire ride to Manhattan, Leora felt like she was going to be sick. Sterling Tower wasn't a building. It was a statement. It loomed over the Hudson, a sleek, twisting blade of black glass and green terraces that seemed to defy physics. It was the only new high-rise in New York that Richard Thorne hadn't been able to stop, and he hated it. The lobby was silent, futuristic. No opulent marble like Richard's buildings. Just polished concrete living green walls and the quiet hum of technology. Ariane Powell, a woman who looked like she could negotiate a hostile takeover before breakfast, met her at the elevator. They rode up in silence, not in a car, but in a high-speed magnetic lift that made Leora's ears pop. The office was at the very top. It was less an office and more a conservatory. A massive glass-domed atrium filled with trees and sunlight offering a 360-degree view of the city. And there, standing not at a desk but in front of a floor-to-ceiling transparent data screen, was Damien Sterling. He was not what she expected. He wasn't a polished CEO like Richard. He was young, perhaps in his late 30s, with an unruly mess of dark hair, a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked more like a grad student than a billionaire. He didn't turn around. Ms. Harris, he said, his voice quiet but resonant. He was still looking at the screen, which was displaying a 3D rotating wireframe of her Oasis project. Mr. Sterling, thank you for seeing me. This is flawed, he said, tapping the screen. The model zoomed in on her water reclamation system. This filtration matrix, it's optimistic. The particulate load from a residential block this dense would overwhelm these algae scrubbers in 6 months. Leora bristled. The panic evaporated, replaced by the familiar fire of an academic defense. It's not flawed, Mr. Sterling. It's conditional, she shot back, stepping forward. The models are based on standard algae, yes. But if you integrate C. Reinhard tie strains genetically modified for accelerated bioremediation, which I know your Sterling Bio division has been perfecting, the efficiency increases by 40%. The models hold. Damien finally turned. His eyes were a piercing, intelligent blue. He wasn't smiling, but there was a new energy in his gaze. He walked over to another part of the model. Your social integration matrix, he said, pointing. You're mixing luxury and subsidized units on the same floors. The industry standard which Thorne Properties perfected is pour doors. It's cynical, but it's profitable. Your model invites conflict. My model invites community, Leora countered, her voice rising. The industry standard is what creates urban blight. It creates us and them. My model uses shared central spaces, the gardens, the agora, the rooftop farms as mandatory interaction points. The exclusivity isn't in the door, it's in the idea. You don't live in Oasis to hide. You live there to participate. She was pacing now, energized. Richard, Mr. Thorne, he always said people want exclusivity. He's wrong. People are lonely. They're desperate for connection. They just haven't been given the infrastructure for it. Oasis isn't a building. It's a social algorithm written in concrete and light. She stopped breathless. Damian Sterling was silent for a full minute. He just watched her. He looked from her back to the screen, then back to her. Richard Thorne, Damian said, testing the name. You know him? It wasn't a question. He's my ex-husband, Leora said, her chin high. A flicker of something passed over Damian's face. Understanding pity. No, it was something harder. It was recognition. I see, he said. He walked back to the main screen and with a single gesture wiped her Oasis design from it. Leora's heart sank. She'd failed. She'd been too much, too argumentative. Richard's voice echoed in her head. You're too intense, Leora. You scare people. Mr. Sterling, The Sterling Prize is for concepts. Damian interrupted, turning to face her. We give $1 million to a charity or a university, we get a nice press release, and the idea dies in an academic paper. He gestured to the empty screen. Your project? Oasis. It's not a concept, Ms. Harris. It's a prototype. And you're right about the filtration. But you're wrong about the load-bearing calculations for the vertical farms. He tapped the screen and a new project appeared. It was massive. It was gorgeous. It was a city. This, he said, is Project Aegis, my division for New World infrastructure. I've been acquiring land for 2 years. A dead shipping yard in Red Hook. It's the perfect test site. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You didn't win the prize, Ms. Harris. Oh, she said, her voice small. I'm dissolving the prize. It's a waste of time. I'm funding this instead. And it needs a chief architect. It needs someone who understands that a building isn't just a box, but a social algorithm. Someone who isn't afraid to argue with me. He extended a hand. I'm not offering you a prize, Leora Harris. I'm offering you a job. I'm offering you the chance to build the impossible. Leora looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the city on the screen. She thought of Richard's scaffolding remark. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she walked to the screen and pointed. The load-bearing calculations are fine, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. If you're using steel, but if you use a laminated timber and graphene-reinforced core, you don't just get support, you get energy storage. Now, about my salary. Damian Sterling threw his head back and laughed. It was a surprising, joyous sound. Ariane, he called out, draw up a contract and find Ms. Harris the best damn engineering team we have. We have work to do. The next 3 months were a blur. Leora moved out of her Greenpoint studio and into a corporate apartment at her insistence, a modest one near the Sterling Tower. Her life, which had shrunk to the size of a single room, suddenly became infinite. Project Aegis was Damian's name, but Oasis was its heart. Leora wasn't just an employee. She was the visionary. Damian had given her a floor, a team of 20 of the world's brightest engineers, urban planners, and sociologists, and a budget that made her head spin. But it wasn't a blank check. It was a challenge. Damian Sterling didn't manage. He interrogated. Their days were a high-octane intellectual battle. The community agora is inefficient. He'd challenge pointing at the blueprint. The foot traffic to vendor ratio is off by 12%. That's because it's not a mall, Damian, she'd fire back, pulling up a social schematic. It's designed to slow people down. The inefficiency is the feature. It forces interaction. Then the interaction is forced. It's inorganic. It is structured, like a Japanese tea ceremony. We're providing the framework for a community that's forgotten how to build itself. He'd stare at the plans, his mind working at a speed she'd never seen in anyone else, and then nod a slow, appraising gesture. Fine, structure it. But if the tea ceremony costs me an extra $50 million, the tea better be damn good. This was their dynamic, a rapid-fire exchange of ideas, a partnership forged in argument and mutual respect. He was the quant, she was the qual. He was the algorithm, she was the soul. He pushed her on engineering and she pushed him on humanity. For the first time in 15 years, Leora felt seen. She wasn't Mrs. Thorne. She wasn't Richard's emotional ex. She was Ms. Harris, the chief architect of Project Aegis. She worked 18-hour days lost in material stress tests and social flow diagrams. She was exhausted, exhilarated, and terrifyingly happy. Meanwhile, the New York high society and real estate world began to notice. The first tremor was a small mention in the Gilded Post, the city's most ruthless gossip paper. The columnist Olivia Sharp was a known entity, a friend of Richard's. Spotted. Which forgotten Park Avenue princess has been seen flitting in and out of Sterling Tower? We hear the ice-cold tech titan Damian Sterling has a new protégé. A pity project, perhaps? Or is she just designing his new doghouse? Leora read it and her blood ran cold. But Damian, when she showed it to him, just shrugged. Does it stop the concrete from curing? He asked, not looking up from a holographic model. No, but... Then it doesn't matter. Get back to work, Harris. Your solar array is underperforming. But Richard Thorne wasn't just a gossip monger. He was a shark who'd smelled blood. And that blood was in Red Hook. Richard had been trying to acquire the same dead shipping yard for years. He wanted to build Thorne Landing, a complex of luxury high-rises that would block out the sun and price out the neighborhood. But he'd been blockaded at every turn by an anonymous holding company that kept outbidding him. Now he knew who it was. Damian Sterling. And in a twist that must have sent Richard into a narcissistic rage, the person designing the project was the ex-wife he'd sworn no one would remember. The smear campaign began in earnest. It was no longer just gossip. It was a professional assassination. Olivia Sharp's column became a weekly anti-Leora newsletter. Thorne's ex a cinder Leora story or a gold-digging gambit. Sources close to Thorne Properties say Leora Harris was let go from her hobby firm years ago due to instability and wildly impractical designs. Her Oasis project was reportedly a failed college paper. Now she's attached herself to Damian Sterling. One has to wonder what this visionary architect is really offering the reclusive billionaire. And it's probably not her blueprints. The article was vile. It implied everything while saying nothing. Leora felt the old shame, the gaslighting, creep back in. She stormed into Damian's office, the tablet in her hand. "You have to make a statement," she said, her voice shaking. "You have to tell them this is a lie. They're calling me a prostitute." Damian put down his stylus and gave her his full attention. His face was cold still. "Do you care what Richard Thorne thinks?" he asked. "I care what my team thinks. I care what your board thinks. This is designed to make me toxic, to make you drop me." "Richard," Damian said, "is a bulldozer. He knows one move flatten everything in his path. He thinks if he flattens you, I'll be exposed. He thinks I'm using you to get at him." "Are you?" Leora asked, the question hanging in the air. Damian stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city. "Richard and I have been on a collision course for a decade. He builds monuments to ego. I build systems. He wants to own the city. I want to change it. This isn't about him, Leora. It's about the work." "But he's making the work impossible." "No," Damian said, turning back to her. "He's making it necessary. He's reminding us why we're doing this. To beat men like him. To build something that lasts longer than his jealousy." He picked up his phone. "Ariane, cancel my meeting with the Tokyo Fund and clear my schedule. Ms. Harris and I are going dark. We're going to the site." For the next month they disappeared. They worked not from the tower but from a shipping container on the windy, desolate Red Hook site. They refined every detail, argued over every bolt, and redesigned the entire project from the ground up, making it stronger, smarter, and more revolutionary. They also, in the quiet hours of the night, started talking about more than just work. He told her about his childhood, a foster kid who taught himself to code. She told him about her dreams, the ones she'd buried under her marriage. One night over cold pizza he looked at her, his eyes serious. "He didn't just sideline you, Lyora. He was afraid of you. Your work. It's better than his. It's always been better." It was the first time she truly believed it. When they emerged, it was with a finalized Project Aegis that wasn't just innovative. It was a declaration of war. The rumor mill had gone quiet. Too quiet. Lyora's absence, coupled with Damien's, had created a vacuum in the New York gossip sphere. Richard Thorne, meanwhile, had taken the silence as a victory. He interpreted their going dark as a retreat. He assumed Damien had finally seen the wisdom in his warnings and had sidelined the unstable ex-wife. Richard, feeling magnanimous in his victory, doubled down. He fast-tracked the announcement for his own rival project, Thorne Resurgence. A gleaming, soulless tower he planned to build right on the edge of the financial district. He secured a major spread in Forbes, proclaiming him the king of the New York comeback. In the article he was quoted, "The future isn't in idealistic community-based fantasies. It's in bold, powerful statements. People want strength. They want a leader, not a committee. This is the new age of the New York Empire." It was a direct shot at Damien's collaborative, community-focused ethos. Lyora read the article in the back of a town car, her stomach in knots. She was on her way to the Global Innovator Summit, a massive Davos-like event where the biggest names in tech, finance, and culture converged. "He's baiting you, you know," she said to Damien, who sat beside her scrolling through data on a tablet. "It's not bait," Damien replied, not looking up. "It's a eulogy. He's memorializing an era that's already dead. He's going to be there, front row." "I know. Ariane arranged it." Lyora's head snapped up. "You invited him." "He invited himself. But Ariane made sure his seats were optimal for visibility." A ghost of a smile played on Damien's lips. "He thinks today is my keynote on AI algorithms. He's coming to see the coder play with his toys." "And what is today's keynote about?" Lyora asked, adjusting the sleeve of her simple, powerfully tailored Armani pantsuit. It was the first time in her life she'd worn armor that wasn't a dress. "Today," Damien said, finally looking at her, his blue eyes locking with hers. "Today is about architecture, the architecture of the future." The auditorium was packed. Thousands of investors, journalists, and tech moguls. And just as Damien had predicted, there in the center of the front row was Richard Thorne. He was in his element, holding court, his arm draped around Isabella Vance, who looked bored and beautiful. Richard gave Lyora a small, pitying nod as she and Damien were escorted to their seats. It was the nod of a king to a former courtier. "Look at you," the nod said, still carrying the briefcase, still the assistant. Lyora's hands clenched, but Damien's hand lightly brushed her elbow, a silent wait. The lights went down. The summit moderator walked on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker needs no introduction. He is the man who has redefined predictive AI logistics and bioengineering. Please welcome Damien Sterling." Damien walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He stood at the center, not behind the podium, but in the open. He looked relaxed, in his element. "Thank you," he began, his voice filling the hall. "We're here to talk about innovation. But for the last 20 years, innovation has been a digital concept. We've built empires in the cloud. We've built worlds inside our phones. But the world we actually live in," he gestured, and the massive screen behind him lit up not with code but with images of bleak, sterile cityscapes. Glass towers, empty plazas, the homeless huddled in the shadows of multi-million-dollar condos. "The world we live in is failing. We've been sold a lie. That progress means privatization. that community is inefficient, that the only purpose of a skyline is to show off wealth. In the front row, Richard Thorne, who had been checking his phone, looked up. His smile faltered. This was not a speech about AI. We've been led by men who build monuments to their own egos. Damien continued, his voice growing stronger. Men who see concrete and steel as weapons of acquisition. Men who build poor doors and call it market segmentation. Men who value a view more than a vision. A low murmur went through the crowd. This was an ambush. These men, Damien said, his gaze sweeping the front row, call themselves architects of the future, but they are just temporary scaffolding. Leora gasped. He was using Richard's own word. Richard Thorne's face went white. He knew in that instant that this was not a keynote. It was an execution. Isabella had visibly leaned away from him. Sterling Industries, Damien announced, is today launching a new division, Project Aegis, a multi-billion-dollar initiative to build the city of tomorrow today, a city built on sustainability, community, and human connection. We are building the first prototype in Red Hook. The screen behind him erupted with the Oasis renderings. Not the old academic ones, but the new, breathtaking, fully realized designs. The vertical farms, the sunlit agoras, the cascading water gardens. The crowd collectively oohed. This is not a concept, Damien said. The ground is being broken as we speak. But I am not the visionary here. I am just the engineer. The architect of this revolution is someone who has been told her ideas were pipe dreams. Someone who was told she would be forgotten. He turned his gaze, finding Leora in the wings where she'd moved. It is my absolute honor to introduce the woman who designed this entire future, the chief architect of Project Aegis, and my future partner, Ms. Leora Harris. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, a perfect crystalline vacuum. It lasted for 1 second, 2, then 3. My future partner, Ms. Leora Harris. The words echoed, amplified. Partner. Richard Thorne looked as if he'd been physically struck. His mouth was open, his face a mask of puce, incredulous rage. The Champagne King of New York had just been checkmated by a tech geek and the scaffolding he'd thrown away. The spotlight hit Leora where she stood in the wings. For a paralyzing moment, she was back at the Met in the shadow of the column, hearing those words. Forgotten. Damien was looking at her not with a command but with an invitation. His hand was outstretched. Leora took a breath. She smoothed the front of her jacket. She thought of her tiny Brooklyn apartment, of the rejection emails, of the condescending smile Richard had given her just 10 minutes ago. She walked out of the shadows and into the light. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at the gasping crowd. She walked directly to Damien Sterling, a small, confident smile on her face. She did not take his outstretched hand. Instead, she stood beside him, as an equal. The auditorium exploded. The applause was deafening. It wasn't just applause. It was a release. The investors seeing the future of urban development. The journalists sensing the biggest business and drama story of the year. The tech crowd seeing their digital-first leader make a massive, unprecedented move into the physical world. Leora stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you, Damien," she said, her voice clear and strong, not a tremor in it. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. We have been sold a lie about how we are supposed to live." She clicked a remote, and a new rendering appeared, a cross-section of the water reclamation system, the C. Reinhardti strains working their magic. For too long, profit and community have been treated as opposing forces. Oasis is not a charity project. It is the single most profitable, sustainable, and scalable urban model ever designed. She was brilliant. She was in her element. She didn't talk about her divorce. She didn't talk about Richard. She talked about material stress, photovoltaic efficiency, and the social ROI of shared public spaces. She was not a victim. She was a visionary. For 20 minutes she held them spellbound. She took their unformed anxieties about loneliness, climate change, and urban decay, and she gave them a blueprint for the solution. When she finished, there was a beat of silence, and then the entire auditorium rose to its feet. A standing ovation. Damian Sterling stood beside her, clapping his eyes, never leaving her face. In the front row, the seats were empty. Richard and Isabella were gone, having slipped out during the technical specifications, their retreat a stark admission of defeat. The aftermath was immediate. The clip of Damian's speech, the cut to Richard's horrified face, and Leora's triumphant walk to the stage went viral before the summit even concluded. The Ghost and the Architect Damian Sterling announces Project Aegis with future partner Leora Harris. Richard Thorne's forgotten wife set to redesign New York. King Richard deposed how a tech billionaire and a visionary architect ended the Thorne dynasty. Olivia Sharp's Gilded Post column was conspicuously silent. Leora's inbox, which had been a digital graveyard, flooded with thousands of emails. Old colleagues apologizing, classmates from MIT cheering, young female architects from around the world calling her an inspiration. The word partner was the talk of the town. Was it business? Was it personal? The ambiguity was its power. To the business world, it meant she was an equity-holding partner in the most valuable new venture of the decade. To the social world, it meant more. Richard hadn't just lost his ex-wife. He'd lost her to his greatest rival. He hadn't just been beaten. He'd been replaced. That evening at the exclusive post-summit reception, Leora was surrounded. Investors, mayors, venture capitalists, all vying for a moment of her time. Richard Thorne tried one last desperate gambit. He cornered Leora by the terrace, his face a mottled red, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "This is a joke, Leora," he spat, grabbing her arm. This boy, he's using you. He's a child playing with blocks. You'll come crawling back to me when his oasis fantasy dries up." "Let go of me, Richard," Leora said, her voice dangerously calm. She didn't try to pull away. "I made you," he hissed. "You were nothing. You'll be nothing again. You told everyone I'd be forgotten." Leora looked down at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. "And you were right in a way. The woman you knew, the one who believed your lies, the one who let you call her work a hobby, she is forgotten. She's gone. You erased her." She leaned in, her voice dropping. "And you should be terrified of the woman who's left." "Ms. Harris." Damian's voice cut through the air. He was standing right behind Richard, flanked by two very large, very calm security guards. "Is there a problem?" Richard dropped his hand from her arm as if it were on fire. He looked from Leora's cold fury to Damian's colder indifference. He was a lion, yes, but this was not his jungle. He was an animal in a cage, and the walls were closing in. Without a word, Richard Thorne turned, and for the first time in his life, he retreated. Leora watched him go, a small, sad figure disappearing into the crowd he used to own. She turned to Damian. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Damian replied. He offered her a glass of champagne. "But I've been wanting to do that for a while." He raised his glass. "To our future partner, Ship," he said, the small smile returning. "Aegis is going to take us a decade at least," he said, his tone shifting from public to private. "That's a partnership, and I don't partner with people I don't intend to keep." Leora clinked her glass against his. "To the work, Damian." "To the work." He agreed, but his eyes said something more. The fall of Richard Thorne was not a sudden cinematic explosion. It was a slow, agonizing bleed, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one delivered by the market he claimed to command. His Thorne Resurgence project, the monument he had staked his name on, became a public joke. After the summit, Resurgence sounded less like a comeback and more like a desperate plea. His primary investors, a consortium of international bankers who cared for nothing but the path of least resistance to profit, began to pull their financing. They didn't call Richard personally. They had their people send sterile, legal-heavy emails. The message was clear: your brand is toxic. We're moving our capital to the Aegis model. Forbes, the same magazine that had crowned him king, ran a follow-up piece titled "The Scaffolding King: How Ego Toppled an Empire." Even Olivia Sharp, the Gilded Post columnist who had been his loyal attack dog, turned on him. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, she wrote a scathing eulogy for his career, painting him as a relic, a dinosaur of development who couldn't adapt. She praised with sickening, sycophantic zeal the breathtaking, human-centric vision of Lyora Harris. The final personal humiliation came not from the market, but from the merger. Isabella Vance arrived at his office not in tears, but in a crisp, steel-gray business suit, her father's lawyer in tow. She placed the offensively large engagement ring on his desk. "The terms of our family's prenuptial merger," she said, her voice as cool as the diamond she was abandoning, "were contingent on a brand synergy that is no longer viable." "This is a temporary setback, Isabella." Richard had blustered, the old roar sounding more like a wheeze. "This is a paradigm shift, Richard," she corrected him, picking a piece of lint from her sleeve. "And you are on the wrong side of it. The Vance family is officially exploring a partnership with Sterling's Aegis initiative. Good luck with your resurgence." But the true execution, the public guillotining, happened at City Hall. The Red Hook waterfront contract was up for its final vote. Richard, looking haggard and visibly smaller in his bespoke suit, made a desperate, rambling presentation based on tax revenue and exclusive luxury. He sounded like a man from another century. Then Leora and Damien took the floor. They didn't talk about luxury, they talked about life. They presented hard data on air quality, community health, and long-term economic stability. Lyora, in a striking midnight blue dress, the same color she'd worn when she was invisible at the Met, spoke with a passion and precision that was mesmerizing. She wasn't just building a complex, she was solving a city's problems. The city council's vote was unanimous. The Thorne proposal was rejected. The Project Aegis master plan was approved. The cameras zoomed in on Richard Thorne's face as he sat frozen. A man turned to stone while the room erupted in applause for the woman he swore would be forgotten. 1 year later, Lyora stood on the rooftop terrace of the first completed Aegis module. It was no longer a blueprint. It was real. The air up here was different. It was soft, carrying the scent of lavender and thyme from the massive planters that lined the roof, not the usual New York miasma of exhaust and hot pavement. Below her, the central agora was bustling. It was 5:00 p.m. and the space was flooded with life. She watched a group of children run laughing from the community daycare toward the central fountain, which cascaded with the building's own reclaimed and purified water. Residents, a mix of artists, bankers, young families, and seniors, just as she'd designed, mingled at a farmer's market, buying produce grown in the vertical farms that made up the tower's southern face. The sound wasn't the shriek of traffic. It was the hum of 1,000 small, connected lives. It was alive. It was breathing. It was hers. The heavy door to the roof opened with a soft, hydraulic sigh. Damien stepped out, a blueprint roll tucked under his arm. He'd traded his T-shirts for more architect-friendly button-downs, but his hair was still an unruly mess, as if he'd been running his hands through it all day. "The air quality sensors on level 12 are reading 15% cleaner than the simulations predicted," he said, foregoing a hello. That was their hello. "Your algae is overperforming. The bioremediation matrix is too efficient." "I told you the C. Reinhardti strains would work," Lyora said, smiling. She leaned back against the railing, looking out over the new skyline they were building together. Their building was a living green heart amidst the cold glass and steel canyons. "It's nice to be right." "It's expensive to be that right," he countered, but the smile in his eyes gave him away. "The accelerated growth means we have to adjust the harvesting schedule for the biomass converters." "A good problem to have," she mused. He came to stand beside her, not too close, but in her space, their shoulders almost touching. They looked out over the city. "So, Damien said, his voice shifting from professional to something else. I just got off the phone with the City of London. They want one. Right on the Thames. Paris wants to replace a defunct industrial park in the 13th. And Singapore? Singapore wants to build 3. We'll be busy, Leora said, a quiet thrill running through her. For the rest of our lives, probably, he said. He was quiet for a full minute, just watching the sunset reflect off the photovoltaic glass of their own creation. The silence between them was comfortable, charged with a year of shared 18-hour days of arguments over structural steel and of victories celebrated with bad takeout on messy blueprints. You know, he said, his voice softer, I've been thinking about the summit that day. Leora turned to look at him. It's hard to forget. That was a high-risk maneuver, he said almost to himself, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Future partner. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Leora's heart did a strange, slow roll. She'd spent a year analyzing that word. It had been her shield, her reintroduction to the world. It had been her armor. I knew what Richard had said about you, Damien continued, finally turning to meet her gaze. I'd read every article. I'd seen the scaffolding quote. He was trying to define you as a temporary attachment to him. He was erasing you. He stepped closer. I couldn't let that stand. But a simple press release, a Sterling Industries is proud to hire, wouldn't have worked. It would have been a footnote. He would have spun it as me picking up his cast-offs. I had to do something. Seismic. I had to rebrand you in the public eye in a single sentence. I had to sever Thorne from Harris with a sword. So you used partner, she said, her voice quiet. I used partner, he confirmed. I needed the world to know in no uncertain terms that you were not his forgotten anything. You were mine, professionally speaking. Professionally speaking. She repeated, a small smile playing on her lips. It was the most ruthless, brilliant, and arrogant PR move I've ever seen. You didn't even ask me. No, I didn't. He admitted, a rare flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. It was a presumption. I was betting on the fact that you, the architect who designed this, he swept his hand toward the living building around them, would understand that sometimes you have to tear down the old foundation to build something true. She had understood. In that moment on stage, she had understood everything. But, he continued, and his voice dropped lower, it's been a year, Leora, a year of this. The project is stable. The world is convinced. London can wait. Paris can wait. And I am, as you frequently pointed out, not a patient man. Not about the things I truly actually want. He took her hand. It wasn't a grab like Richard's had been, a gesture of ownership. It was a question, his fingers lightly, respectfully entangling with hers. I don't just want to build cities with you, Leora Harris, he said, his blue eyes intense and completely terrifyingly sincere. That's the business partnership. And it's the best one I've ever had. I respect your mind more than anyone I've ever met. Damien. But I'm also interested in the other definition of partner, the one the gossip columns were hoping for, the one Richard was terrified of. He gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. I'm a data-driven man, Leora, and all the data, every piece of it, points to this, to you. Leora looked at this brilliant, intense, impossible man, the man who hadn't saved her. He hadn't been a knight in shining armor. He had been a mirror showing her the strength that was already there. He had given her the tools, the budget, and the respect to save herself. Richard had wanted to own her. Damien was asking to stand beside her. Damien, she said, her voice full and strong, her fingers tightening around his. What if I told you the social algorithm for Oasis was never just about the residents? What if I told you it was always designed for a partnership of two? He smiled, a true, rare, brilliant smile that reached his eyes and made him look for a second like a different person. I'd say I'm a man who trusts the architect. And what if I told you? She continued stepping closer, closing the last bit of space between them. That after a year of working with you, of arguing with you, of building this, that you are the only variable I'm no longer willing to run the simulations without. Lyora. He breathed, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. Show me the blueprint, Damien, she whispered. And he did. He kissed her not with the desperate claiming hunger of a man like Richard, but with the quiet, profound certainty of a man who has finally solved the most complex equation of his life. It was a kiss of mutual respect, of shared victories, of 18-hour days and cold coffee. It was a kiss that felt like a foundation. As the sun set, casting long golden shadows across their city, Lyora Harris, the woman who was supposed to be forgotten, pulled back and rested her forehead against his. She was the architect, he was the engineer, and together they looked out at the future they were building. And for the first time the blueprint was perfectly, completely clear. The perfect revenge isn't just success. It's becoming undeniable. Lyora's story shows that your greatest work, your true calling, often comes right after your greatest setback. She wasn't just scaffolding for someone else's life. She was the architect of her own. What did you think of Richard's downfall? Was Damien's move at the summit pure business, or was it the most epic romantic gesture of all time? Let me know your favorite part of the story in the comments below. And if you love stories about impossible comebacks, getting that second chance and proving everyone wrong, please do me a huge favor, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You don't want to miss the next story. Trust me, the drama is just getting started.